Hi, this is Clay Warren, Head of Digital CX at Qualtrics. And I want to welcome you to a webcast series we're calling the Digital Playbook. In this webcast series, we'll discuss all things digital marketing, digital analytics, digital strategy, and digital customer experience. Throughout this series, we'll invite industry experts and digital practitioners to discuss and debate these topics. Today, we're going to be talking about digitization and the B2B digital customer experience with VP of Marketing at MRM, Chad Warren. Welcome, Chad. Good to have you on.
Thanks, Clay. Happy to be here.
Chad, can you tell us a little bit about MRM, your role, and the types of problems that MRM is tasked with solving?
Yeah, absolutely. So MRM is a full-service marketing agency with a heavy digital focus. Our emphasis is on helping brands grow meaningful relationships with people. We have about 3,900 people globally. We're part of the IPG network. We focus on a lot of digital strategy, digital transformation work. And my role is I lead MRM's marketing orchestration practice globally. So how we harness the use of technology and data to orchestrate and automate primarily the digital customer journey. I also work as a part of MRM's B2B Center of Excellence, where we work with brands like Verizon and Cisco and Panasonic and several others in addressing their challenges in B2B.
That's great. Very interesting. And fascinating that you are part of that B2B Center of Excellence. We brought you on today because we want to pick your brain on digital strategy and B2B. And as we were preparing for this, one of the things I've been thinking about is you and I have both been in digital and working with B2B brands for more than a decade, combined well over 20 years. What's interesting is how we've seen some B2B brands, specifically tech brands, who have embraced digital transformation and have digitized a lot of their processes, product delivery, among other things, while other traditional B2B brands have lagged behind. There's also ample research and data that indicates that digital leaders in B2B achieve 5 times the revenue growth versus laggards, yet only 1 in 3 B2B companies have embraced digital transformation. Why do you think that is?
Well, Clay, I think old habits die hard, for one. When I look at most marketing departments, and I've had, I feel like some really good opportunity to have an inside look at how a lot of companies, both on the consumer and B2B side, operate throughout my career. Is when you look at their marketing department, besides having an IT department, the way the marketing department works and operates and the way that they get work done and organized to get that work done hasn't changed in about 75 years. I would argue that the marketing department for today, and I would say equally on the sales side, uses a fundamentally outdated model relative to the current marketplace in order to drive success for its business. And however, these motions get very, very well ingrained, and we get very, very used to a way of doing things, and it's difficult to make that transition. So I think that new entrants, this is kind of classic disruption theory. New entrants or innovation theory rather, have a distinct advantage because they're really starting these efforts from scratch. And so there's an opportunity to build the right tool for the right job. And they don't have to reverse engineer a system that they've had in place for a long time. And, I saw an example of that. I saw an example of that just the other day. I was talking to a large brand, and one of the concepts we were talking to that brand about was shifting their focus from a lead-based view from a B2B marketing perspective to more of a company or an account-based view, under the recognition that that, as we know, that there's a lot of people involved in buying decisions at companies, and that we have to address a lot of their needs, and more of that customer journey is in digital. And the response I got from the individual was smart and understandable, recognized this problem, said, look, I hear you and I get what you're saying, and I even believe what you're saying. But the reality is I have several hundred sales reps that are sitting around waiting to call down on leads.
Yeah,
And go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. Well, it's super interesting because the traditional B2B model is I have a large sales force and we have a set of accounts that we go and work and we nurture and we build relationships. Yet we're in a world where most of everything can be digitized. If you think about the B2B sales cycle, there's so much research now that says buyers are going, they're, what is it, 80% way all the way through the buying process before they want to engage with somebody in sales. And yet there are these large B2B corporations that continue to rely on traditional selling models. How are you thinking about that as a digital strategist for the brands that you work with?
Well, I think it starts with an understanding of, and I mean, you kind of begin to touch on this. It starts with an understanding of the customer, and a couple things are at play, right? Like what you talked about has been it sounds almost silly at this point to talk about the advent of digital, right? But we're in that movement, right? And continue to progress it. And it's accelerating now with what's happening in the world with everyone working from home. But the reality is where research happens, where decision making happens, it's all happening in digital, and all those decisions are happening there. And along with that is the buyers themselves are changing. So, there is more of a reluctance to talk to a salesperson. There is more of, if you look and you understand the consumer in general, there is less of a desire to engage in those conversations and more to do kind of individualized and research. There is more of a call for transparency. That's been a big term that we talk about a lot in business and in digital in particular. Over the last several years. And look, I mean, there's a perception that, at risk of, alienated some people within a broader audience, that those principles of like transparency and things like that are not, are not exactly the calling card of the enterprise sales world, right? Or at least that's not the perception that continues to get perpetuated. And so, people want to make those decisions. One thing that comes to mind that I think I can make a good correlation in the consumer side is you look at what Tesla did, and we can debate the merits of their innovation across several fronts. But one area where they innovated is they did away with the dealer model. So they cut the salesperson out largely. And as most people have seen, like that didn't go over very well. And in fact, to the point where there was lobbying groups and getting government involved to attempt to enforce a disintermediated sales model upon consumers in the purchase of a vehicle. And, and we're perpetuating that because we have these institutionalized systems. But I also think it's a maturity thing too. It's like, we don't always see what is possible, so we kind of just do what we're used to.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Tesla has completely disrupted the automobile or the car buying model. And you're starting to see other auto manufacturers follow suit, that you can essentially move that entire buying process online. What's interesting is if I'm selling a tractor, I'm selling a turbine, you could basically replicate that model. And that's what's interesting is as brands start to think about their own digital transformation, and a lot of that could be cutting costs, gaining efficiency, which helps them scale as well through digital channels. That Tesla model is very interesting to see if they can replicate. If I'm John Deere, or if I'm Honeywell, if I'm any one of these brands, and I'm thinking, how do I digitize this buying process with my customers? So, but Chad, you're not just talking about building a website though. you're talking about a digital strategy in B2B. Talk about how you think of, if I'm a B2B brand, it's so much more than just building a website and a commerce channel. How else should I be thinking about how to move, about digital transformation or about digital strategy for increasing sales and increasing my penetration with customers?
Well, in that regard, I think this is the kind of the customer value conversation, like what problems are you solving for your customer, which is universal right across marketing. An example that I think of that comes to mind is what the Coca-Cola company is doing. They're one of many, because this is not all doom and gloom, but this is a business that has very, very traditional, it's been around for, 100 years, right? They are
Right.
very traditionally been, they kind of come from, I know it's food and beverage, but right, it's kind of more broadly part of kind of the manufacturing space, right? Which has been one of the slowest verticals to digitally transform. And they do still sell product through bottlers, through a bottler ecosystem. But they went out and they recognized that the whole bottler ecosystem was built around, these individualized relationships. And those relationships with salespeople, that has to scale pretty broadly when you're considering every business that buys Coke from McDonald's to Joe's Pizzeria in Peoria, Indiana, right? They have to scale out that sales force to do that. And so there's kind of a clear use case and opportunity to go solve some of those problems. And they did start with a website. Now you'd be like, oh, okay, that's not really an omni-channel or a holistic digital strategy. But when you consider that is, for most brands, like that's kind of the primary front upon which you're going to begin to kind of address those problems, that makes sense that they would do that. So they essentially built a platform that allows, considering like, well, what are all the problems we want to solve for our customers? Well, we want to make it possible that they can order product from us, that they can automate the ordering process, right? Like by setting up order renewals, that they can make service requests for their equipment, right, at their dining locations and other outlets, that recommendations can be made. And but to their credit, they're not thinking about it just as, oh, we're just going to stand up a website, right? So
Right.
they're extending that to mobile, like in a mobile app. And then they're even going beyond that to say, how can we leverage other channels? Again, this may not sound very sexy, right? But like, email being another primary communications channel that isn't
Mm-hmm.
going away,
Right.
is that they're trying to mobilize that channel as well as how can we, build triggered communications to drive both recommendations and drive notifications and inform and to keep our outlets, these customers moving and quite frankly, buying more Coke product.
Yeah, that's interesting. Anheuser-Busch is another brand that's done something similar. We've seen that they've transitioned where now, if you want a 12-pack of beer on your left at your door, you can get that within 30 minutes, an hour. You can actually go online into, they have a commerce shop that will procure their product through local vendors, and you can get it delivered. And I think that's innovation. It doesn't sound like much, but from a B2B or a B2B2C in that case, that's certainly transformation in its own. And it's strategic in that they're increasing their scale, improving efficiency. And I love what you mentioned about this idea of, it's not just selling product. It's the holistic value chain or the full value chain with a B2B company. Is how are they doing services, delivering services? And even just as importantly is how they're measuring those experiences. Are they measuring them so they can consistently optimize or have an always on optimization strategy to make sure those experiences are better? What are some of the ways, or tell me about some of the examples of how B2B brands are rethinking their customer journey in some of the brands that you've worked with in the past?
That's a good question.
I mean, and what I mean, I'm trying to get into this idea of, brands I felt like they've been so stuck in B2B on this. Not only do they have their traditional sales model or traditional service model, but we often talk about how brands, if they want to, how do they start delivering services through digital channels? How do they start, optimizing their own value chain? That if I'm a typical manufacturer, it's not just a website or a mobile app, but I need to start engaging with customers differently, and how they can start delivering value through digital channels more effectively. I wonder if you've had any experience that with some of the brands that you've worked with.
Yeah, so a good example of that, and we could look from a pre-sales perspective, from a post-sales perspective. There's good examples for both, but like on the pre-sale side of things, there is a broadening recognition, and this is still catching on quite a bit, that as you had kind of spoke to earlier, that more and more of the sales process is happening in digital. And while that's like beginning to be recognized, I think a lot of people still scratch their head and are not quite sure. A lot of brands scratch their head and they're not quite sure, like, well, what does that mean? And from my perspective, what that means is that I think of it in terms of, if you think about it in a customer-centric way, it is categorically difficult for businesses to buy from other businesses. The B2B customer journey is really hard because decision-making, especially at the enterprise level, it's made in buying committees. There's lots of different people on those buying committees that all have a different role in that decision. Anyone from decision makers to like procurement, who has a very, very different set of needs than a decision maker. And I think that as brands further recognize all of the people in that are part of that decision, and recognize that it is difficult to buy, then it puts them in a better position to say, okay, how do we make it easier to buy? And again, that's not how most brands think of it. They say, well, how do we make it easier to sell? And they should be thinking about the other way around, is like, how do we make this easier to buy? And when you frame it in that context, which I think personally is a relatively simple context to think of it within, then all of a sudden it opens the door to start thinking like, okay, so what kind of tools and what kind of information and what kind of, and otherwise do we need to provide and make available to our customers to help them make decisions? And I'd say if you combine that kind of concept with this idea that at the end of the day, you're solving, your job is to solve a customer problem. It is not to sell a product, right? Like if you think of it in those terms, then you're well equipped. You're much better equipped to be able to drive value for your business, because it ends up being a value exchange. Right. You are surfacing and solving a problem for your customer, and you're making it easy for them to solve that problem. And and a lot of times it starts with helping your customer identify a problem that they didn't know that they had. But that's value in and of itself, right? If I'm a business leader and I'm thinking every day about how to solve problems for my business, and I go read a great piece by Verizon about mobile security and how big of a challenge that is for corporations, and it's not focused on Verizon's mobile security products, but it's focused on objective perspectives about what is the reality out in the world, then, and that makes me think differently about solving that problem. Well, who do you think that I'm going to go to and invest, or at least at a minimum investigate first, to solve my mobile security problems? Well, I'm going to go to Verizon.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. And content, as you were alluding to, is a key strategic pillar for any B2B business. But I still feel like, we're stuck in even traditional realms of B2B content, white papers, long form white papers, or PDFs. And we're kind of getting in a different topic, but very interesting. And as I think about just digital strategy and B2B, any other thing that come to mind? What other tips that you would, if for our listeners, who are part of a B2B marketing team, who are part of a B2B strategy team, who are trying to help their brands go through digital transformation and in the realm of their own responsibilities. What tips or tricks would you give any of our listeners?
So one thing that comes to mind is that is to there's innovation for its own sake. They're saying like, okay, well, we need to go and be an X channel, or we need to go and acquire X technology. And then there's being kind of more purposeful about that. And while that sounds kind of like that sounds maybe an obvious tip, this happens quite a lot, where the acquisition of technology is used to essentially to solve a business problem, where technology itself, there's I think it's a Peter Drucker quote, people want a 1/4-inch hole, not a 1/4-inch drill. And at the end of the day, in many cases, there can be a lot of different tools that can solve a problem, but it's not the tool itself that solves the problem. So we need to stop looking towards that next channel, whether it's social or a mobile app or whatever, or looking towards that next content piece, like, oh, video is the platform that's going to solve all of our problems. Or if I go acquire X vendor, if we go implement a CDP, man, that's gonna fix it all, because it's not. It's thinking much more purposefully about what. Again, I mean, I hate to overly beat this as a drum, but this is the definition of being customer centric, right? Like you had mentioned about this overindulgence in long form kind of white paper type thing as a B2B marketing tool. And well, why should we consider moving away from that? Why should any brand consider moving away from that? Well, okay, let's think about it from a customer perspective. So number one, like PDFs are not a largely discoverable asset, right? So when you think like, well, how do consumers find things? Well, they discover them through channels like social, or they search for things, whether implicitly or explicitly, on search engines. Well, PDFs are not a largely discoverable asset format. They also don't spend, most people aren't going to spend like an hour or 45 minutes reading a white paper, right? So we have to consider like, okay, well, who is my audience and what do they want and how do they like to consume things and where do they like to consume things? And then on top of that, as I'd mentioned earlier, what is the insight that we can bring to that conversation that is actually providing them value? That's where I think a lot of brands, I would argue, just to put it another way, are stuck, is we're taking the old model of advertising, which is really just saying something, and we're just moving it into new formats, where what we really need to be doing is doing something, providing some kind of value to the consumer.
Yeah, it's interesting this how you've mentioned value, and I've been preparing some other content for a customer of mine, and he or she was asking me about how should we think about digital customer experience. And I said digital customer experience is all about understanding how to deliver value to your customers through digital channels. It's not so much about just digital or offline. It's about using digital channels to deliver value, and you can do that. And that's where B2B brands need to kind of tie off on this. Where they need to start focusing is, how do I deliver better value to my customers through digital channels? That doesn't mean just creating new tools or like you mentioned, it's not only about acquiring new technology. It's a cultural shift in understanding how to deliver customer value. That requires understanding your customers inside and out, becoming customer centric, and developing insights about the channels they want to engage in, the type of content, the problems they're trying to solve. So this has been very, very valuable. Chad, thanks so much for joining us today. I really appreciate how you've laid out the playbook for digital strategy and B2B.
I really appreciate the opportunity, and thank you so much.
And if for all of our listeners, if you want to talk about anything you heard on the webcast or about how Qualtrics can help your business customer experience, please feel free to email me at claywarren@qualtrics.com or visit our website, qualtrics.com, for more information. Thank you.